At 1:15 in the morning, Brandon Swanson was on the phone with his father. The call wasn't urgent. There was no screaming, no panic in his voice. If anything, Brandon sounded calm, almost casual. He told his parents he'd been in a small accident. He said he wasn't hurt. He just needed help figuring out where he was. For 47 minutes, his parents stayed on the line. They listened as their son walked alone through the dark Minnesota countryside. They could hear his footsteps on gravel. They could hear the wind moving through the fields. At one point, Brandon mentioned water nearby. At another, he talked about fences. His parents were searching for him while he walked. Both sides believing they were getting closer. Then, suddenly, Brandon said 2 words. "Oh shit." After that, there was silence. The phone call didn't disconnect. The line stayed open. Brian and Annette Swanson called their son's name again and again, waiting for a response that never came. Brandon Swanson was never heard from again. No one witnessed what happened in those final seconds. No one knows what he saw. No one knows exactly what went wrong. All that remains is a phone call that lasted 47 minutes. And ended in complete silence. Brandon Swanson was 20 years old when he disappeared. He was a student at Minnesota West Community and Technical College, studying wind energy technology. It wasn't a random choice. Brandon liked practical work. He liked the idea of building a stable future. Friends described him as dependable. His parents described him as responsible. Brandon wasn't known for taking risks. He didn't have a history of drug use. He wasn't struggling with mental health issues. Most importantly, Brandon had no reason to disappear. He was close with his parents. He stayed in regular contact with them. If he was running late or had a problem, he called. On the night he vanished, Brandon had gone out with friends to celebrate the end of the college semester. It was a normal night. Nothing out of the ordinary. No arguments. No emotional goodbyes. When Brandon left, his friends believed he made it home safely. That assumption would turn out to be tragically wrong. To understand why this case is so disturbing, it's important to understand this one fact. Brandon Swanson was not the kind of person who simply vanished without explanation. There was no note. No plan. No secret life uncovered later. Everything about Brandon's life pointed toward a young man who expected to be home the next day. Which makes what happened next even harder to explain. Shortly after midnight on May 14, 2008, Brandon Swanson left his friends and began driving toward his parents' home in Marshall, Minnesota. The drive should have been routine. But at some point along the way, Brandon took a wrong turn. The roads in that area are rural, long stretches of gravel, no streetlights, very few landmarks. At night, it's easy to lose your sense of direction. Brandon's car went off the road and ended up in a ditch. Later investigations showed that the accident itself was minor. The car wasn't heavily damaged. There were no signs of a serious collision. No blood. No deployed airbags. Brandon wasn't injured. But the car was stuck. He tried to get it out on his own. It didn't work. Standing alone in the dark, Brandon made a decision that would set everything else in motion. He called his parents. At first, he spoke to his mother, Annette. He told her he'd been in a small accident. He reassured her that he was okay. He said he just needed help figuring out where he was. Soon after, his father, Brian Swanson, joined the call. Together, they tried to pinpoint Brandon's location. Brandon told them he believed he was near the town of Lind. This detail mattered, because it shaped every decision that followed. Based on what Brandon said, Brian and Annette got into their car and began driving toward Lind. They believed they were heading straight for their son. At the same time, Brandon decided to leave his car and start walking. He thought he could reach nearby lights he saw in the distance. He believed help was close. What none of them realized in that moment was that Brandon had already made a critical mistake. He wasn't where he thought he was. As Brian and Annette Swanson drove toward the town of Lind, they stayed on the phone with their son. The call felt practical at first. Almost routine. They asked Brandon what he could see. Gravel roads. Open fields. No houses nearby. Brandon sounded steady. A little embarrassed, even. Like someone who had made a small mistake and just wanted to fix it. He told his parents he thought he could see lights in the distance. Brian assumed those lights were coming from Lind. Based on that assumption, he began giving Brandon directions. Turn this way. Walk toward the road. Stay on the line. Brandon agreed. He left his car behind and started walking. For the next 47 minutes, the Swansons remained connected. Their voices traveling through the darkness while Brandon moved farther away from the place where his car sat abandoned. Brian and Annette expected to see Brandon at any moment. They slowed their car. They scanned the roadside. They called his name. But they didn't see him. And Brandon didn't see them. At one point, Brandon said he thought he heard a car. Brian told him to wave his arms. Nothing happened. Both sides were growing confused, but neither realized the truth yet. They were searching in the wrong place. As the minutes passed, the phone call became the only thing holding the situation together. Brian later said he could hear Brandon walking the entire time. Footsteps. The sound of gravel shifting under his shoes. Heavy breathing from the effort. Brandon mentioned crossing fences. At another point, he said the ground felt uneven. Then he said something else that stuck with his parents. He could hear water. This detail didn't alarm them at the time. In rural Minnesota, water isn't unusual. There are ditches, creeks, drainage areas everywhere. But investigators would later realize how important that moment was. Brandon continued walking, convinced he was still on a road. In reality, he had likely already left it. What makes this part of the story so painful is how close everyone was to understanding what was wrong, and how far away they still were. Brian and Annette were driving back and forth, trying to match Brandon's descriptions to the landscape around them. Nothing lined up. Brandon couldn't see their headlights. They couldn't see him. Frustration began to creep into their voices. Brian urged Brandon to stay where he was. But Brandon didn't want to stop. He believed he was making progress. He believed help was just ahead. The phone call continued, stretching on far longer than anyone expected. And still, no one realized the critical mistake. Brandon was not walking toward Lind. He was walking in the opposite direction. As the call went on, tension began to build. Brian could hear the strain in his son's voice, not fear, but exhaustion. Brandon had been walking in the dark for nearly an hour. He was tired. Cold. Confused. At one point, Brian told him again to stop walking and stay put. Brandon hesitated. He didn't want to stand alone in the dark. He wanted to keep moving. He wanted this to be over. That decision, to keep walking, would become one of the most tragic elements of the case. Because later analysis showed that Brandon was likely closer to safety earlier in the call than he was at the end. Every step he took carried him farther away. Brian and Annette slowed their car almost to a crawl, scanning both sides of the road. They called Brandon's name through the open windows. They listened for any sound. Nothing. Then, without warning, the tone of the call changed. There was a pause. And Brandon said 2 words. "Oh shit." Those words weren't screamed. They weren't dragged out. They sounded sudden. Instinctive. Like the reaction to something unexpected. Immediately after that, Brandon went silent. Brian and Annette called his name. Again. And again. The line stayed open. But Brandon never responded. Police were contacted shortly after the call went silent. At first, there was hope. Brandon had been talking only minutes earlier. He hadn't sounded injured. He hadn't asked for help in panic. Officers located Brandon's car later that morning. It was sitting quietly in a ditch, just off a rural road. The scene raised immediate questions. The car wasn't badly damaged. There was no sign of a struggle. No blood. No personal belongings scattered nearby. It looked like a car that had simply been driven off the road. Search teams began combing the surrounding area. They walked fields. They checked ditches. They called Brandon's name. Nothing. What investigators didn't know yet was that the search was centered on the wrong location. Because Brandon had believed he was near Lind, the initial search focused heavily on that area. But later analysis of cell phone data would suggest something different. Brandon had not been where he thought he was. And by the time this became clear, crucial hours had already passed. As daylight faded into another night, concern turned into fear. A missing person case was officially opened. But there was still no clear direction. No witnesses. No confirmed path. No final location. Just a car in a ditch, and a phone call that ended mid-sentence. As days turned into weeks, investigators began reconstructing the night Brandon disappeared. They reviewed the phone call timeline. They mapped the area. They studied the terrain. Slowly, a troubling picture emerged. Brandon's understanding of his location had been wrong from the beginning. Based on cell tower data, investigators later concluded that Brandon was likely several miles away from Lind. This meant that both Brandon and his parents had been working from a false assumption. Directions were based on the wrong town. Search efforts were focused in the wrong area. By the time this error was fully understood, search conditions had changed. Weather. Vegetation growth. Water levels. Time had erased whatever fragile clues may have existed that first night. There was also the issue of communication. Brandon's phone battery eventually died. Whatever final moments occurred after the call went silent were never recorded. No voicemail. No emergency call. No final message. For Brandon's parents, this realization was devastating. They had been doing everything they could. Driving, searching, staying on the line. But the system they trusted failed to catch a simple but fatal misunderstanding. Not because of negligence. Not because of malice. But because everyone involved believed the same incorrect detail. And once that belief took hold, it guided every decision that followed. Investigators eventually came to a conclusion that was both logical and deeply unsettling. They believed Brandon Swanson likely fell into a ditch or creek during the call. The area was filled with drainage channels, some several feet deep, many hidden by tall grass. At night, without light, these ditches are nearly invisible. A single misstep would have been enough. Investigators believe Brandon's final words, "Oh shit," were a reaction to sudden realization. Not fear of another person. Not a confrontation. But the instant something went wrong. If Brandon fell, several things could have happened. He could have been injured. He could have lost consciousness. He could have dropped his phone. If water was involved, cold shock and panic could have overwhelmed him within seconds. Despite extensive searches, Brandon was never found. Fields were searched repeatedly. Ditches were examined. Volunteers returned year after year. Nothing. For Brandon's parents, the hardest part is how close help may have been. They were on the road. They were listening. They were trying. But darkness, distance, and one mistaken assumption created a gap that could never be closed. Brandon Swanson has never been located. And the phone call that lasted 47 minutes remains the closest anyone will ever come to understanding his final moments.